Welcome to ADHD Realities, where we explore and talk about all things ADHD and sexuality. I'm your host, Leanne Borneman, certified sex therapist and sexologist, and today I have Natassia Miller joining us, who is the founder of Wonderlust, as well as a sex educator and coach specializing in bridging couples' mismatched desires. She's also the host of Sex Talks, an intimacy event series at Soho House, New York. Natassia is also a graduate of Columbia University and worked in finance prior to becoming an entrepreneur. Today, we are going to be talking with Natassia about all things desire. What is it? What are some of the misconceptions? How hormones can play a role in how we experience desire? And the importance of communication. We'll wrap up by also exploring some fun ways to make playtime more inviting. So let's jump in. All right, so I have the infamous Natassia Miller here today. I'm really, really excited because today we get to talk a little bit more about desire. And before we get into it, for us ADHDers, desire can be really a hard thing to struggle with. We come packed with our own negative experiences growing up, people not getting us, having conflicts, people pleasing tendencies. And so when we unpack desire, it can really make or break our experiences. So I'm really happy to have you here today to talk more about this and your expertise. So if you want to introduce yourself, say hello to everybody.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. This has been some time in the making. My name is Natasha. I'm a sexologist. I'm also founder of Wonderlust, a sexual wellness company that helps couples strengthen their connection and desire. We have an intimacy card deck to help couples talk about sex and communicate about something that can be very awkward and hard to get to. And we also have a desire masterclass to help couples reconnect.
That is awesome. And just so everyone knows, I will fully self disclose. One of the reasons I wanted you on here is because me and my husband actually have used your Desire deck. And without you probably even recognizing it, it has been one of the most ADHD friendly tools that we have implemented in our life. And so I hope everyone will go out and get some because it's definitely been a helpful tool for both of us. So before we get into, I guess, the juicy parts of desire, can you start off just kind of just defining what desire really is? And maybe some of the misconceptions you have seen across your experience around desire.
Yeah, desire is when our brain registers that we are turned on, right? That's at its root is what it is. It's also a word that's used interchangeably with libido. And I think something that can be hard for people who well, there are two types of desire styles mainly. There is the spontaneous desire, which is when you realize instantly that you're turned on, and then you become aroused, which means it's the physical manifestation of your arousal. You become hard, you become wet, you feel the tingles down there. Um, and you can also have responsive desire. And responsive desire is when you actually become physically aroused first, and then you realize that you are turned on. Um, they end up kind of getting bogged down into responsive is what the majority of women and people with vulvas experience. Spontaneous is what the majority of men and people with penises experience. Um, Something that we talk about less is that with spontaneous desire, it's very much like testosterone drives that. And I think that's something that we need to talk more about is like the hormonal impact of desire. But that's kind of what it boils down to. And it's the reason why, in general, especially with heterosexual couples, there's usually that like mismatch in desire,
Yeah,
and the woman
definitely.
tends to fall into the responsive and the man into the spontaneous. And they're like, how do we bridge that gap? So, at its simplest form, this is like what desire and different desire styles boil down to.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of that, in the clinical work I do, I mostly see heterosexual couples, not, by choice. It's just what do I attract, apparently. And what you just said is spot on. The wife is generally a lower level desire, and the husband is on a higher level, and there's that mismatch, and it creates like shame, guilt, and what I've noticed is a lot of people are very insecure about leaning into conversations around these topics or feeling equipped to have conversations. So, leaning into this topic, since it's a very popular one, like what's the work you do, or what would you suggest when you are in a relationship and you clearly have different desire types? What would be the go-to first steps for people around feeling comfortable and engaging in this?
In communication
Yeah,
specifically.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So with communication, I think they're like, it depends on where you are on the spectrum, but I think that if you're starting off from a place where you're feeling really closed about it, it's important for you to first like sit down and reflect and journal on what are the things that make you feel really uncomfortable to talk about? Like, what are the words and the phrases? And write those down so that you're just like well aware of them, and you put them. It's almost like once you say it, once you write it down, it becomes less taboo for you. You're like overcoming that first obstacle. And then the second step is to practice in the mirror saying these words and then saying the specific uh, phrases that you're wanting to communicate to your partner. Like, when you touch me like this, it makes me feel uncomfortable because, or I want to talk about sex because it matters to me and I want us to have a stronger sexual connection. Like, whatever it is that you're going through, practicing in the mirror is always going to help to build confidence beforehand. And then how you have that conversation with your partner, also a few different ways. You can have a conversation about the conversation, which is actually a little bit more direct, but it helps to set expectations in place. Like, it's been a long time since we haven't talked about our sex life. I want to make sure that we're both fulfilled. And I'd love to touch base with you on this. Like, is there a time that works best? Like, when can we sit down and talk about it? I think that can be a really helpful way to start. Or you can start more indirectly and forward an article, a podcast episode, a TV show episode. Like Goop Sex Love has a few episodes that could be interesting to open each other's minds. And you can just forward that to them and say, you know, came across this, like, this is what stood out to me, or I thought this was interesting for us to explore. What do you think about it? Right? The what do you think about it is a very like low stakes way of gauging what their reaction is going to be. You can also bring up a really great memory that you had. Like, remember that trip that we had, 5 years ago to Italy, and we couldn't keep our hands off of each other. I really miss that. Like, what do you miss most about our sex life? Or you can talk about, I remembered this, like, that one time that we did XYZ in bed, and it just like made me smile, or it really turned me on just thinking about it. And I was wondering, what was your favorite sexual memory of us? Like, some of these prompts are in the card deck, but I think I named like five different examples of how you can bring up, you know, communication with your partner that might not feel like the,
Pointing the
I would
finger,
say,
like,
pointing the finger, unhelpful,
yeah.
we are not in a good place. Like,
Mm-hmm. And I really like that about what you just were talking about, like bringing up the memories of, what you like, being collaborative and making it really about each other, and that interest of, doing more fun or excitement or exploring, and something you also brought up was expectations. And I wonder if how expectations have played in things you've observed with people you've worked with. Is that really a huge issue for a lot of the clients you work with? Because the clients I work with, we generally are unpacking how expectations play a significant role in how we're showing up in our sex, in our relationships as like an ADHDer. But I'm curious if that also has been a popular area of exploration for you and the clients you work with.
aligning the expectations of what they want to get out of their sex life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or not saying them, and that being a huge barrier to exploring desire and satisfaction.
Yeah, I think that is generally the root of the problem is, whatever expectation you have, you think that is normal. What was your education like about sex? Was it through porn? Was it through, what you heard from your friends, like how frequently they're having sex? Is your expectation of how frequently you should be having sex? Do you think that everybody's having a certain kind of sex that you think you should be having, but people don't consider what it is that works for them and what they want out of it? I think that's actually a really big problem with if you talk about sexual fantasies, and
Mm,
you'll hear often from people saying, like, well, I don't have a fantasy. I've actually never even stopped to think about it because they don't consider what it is that they want. Or they might think that whatever it is that they crave is something that is just so simple that it doesn't count as a fantasy.
that's a really good
And
point. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's something that especially I hear from women a lot. And I'm like, listen, if your fantasy is having 8 hours of sleep and like well rested, like sex, and your partner comes up behind you and gives you like a kiss, in your neck to initiate sex, like that is a fantasy. It's like literally whatever turns you on in that's stimulating your imagination. If that gets you off, that's what matters. Like that counts as a
Hmm.
fantasy, right? No matter how small or vanilla it
Yeah.
is.
I actually tell clients all the time when we explore this concept of fantasy that, like, I have a fantasy of going to England for 2 weeks without any of my family members because, boy, does that sound wonderful, right? It can be so small. That is a fantasy,
Yeah,
something that intrigues you. I wouldn't do it, right? Like, I would still want to be with my family, but the idea sounds really nice. And,
exactly.
and I'm curious though, like, because you were also talking about the difference between spontaneous and responsive desire. And we talked also briefly about how we do see a lot of, men versus women in terms of their desire types. What would you suggest individuals do, couples do when there is that discrepancy? How do we find that natural balance? Because I think that's one of the things I notice also, is but I want more spontaneous. And then the couple, the partner, they're like, but that doesn't work for me, right? How do we find that happy balance? And is that possible?
I think it I think it ebbs and flows throughout your life. So you can find a balance at some point, but there will be an imbalance at another point, and that's okay. Like that's life, and I think people need to understand that a little bit more and be more um empathetic to their partners about it. But uh the easiest way for you to consider bridging that gap is, are you having sex worth having? Right? Like that's something that
Mm,
we as educators and counselors, like we always talk about this in the space. The main reason why a lot of people aren't craving that sex is because what they're having is pretty bland. And so it's really hard for you to want it when it's not that exciting, and you remember at the moment, like, this isn't the last time it wasn't that great, or the last few times it wasn't that great. So, generally, men and people with penises, for them, penetration tends to be something very easy for them to get off of. But for women and people with vulvas, more variety is what excites them. And so, but the problem is that women tend to be conditioned to be very agreeable and to place other people's priorities and necessities before theirs. And so often what you'll find is that women have a hard time advocating for themselves in bed. And especially because we were grown up being told that we should protect our bodies and
mm,
absolutely everything that basically tells us that we shouldn't be sexually open or explorative because that's crude and vulgar and not very ladylike of us, right? And so that prevents us from even considering what it is that we want to explore at all, like what it is that we want. And
yeah.
so when you first ask that to a client, it's probably the first time they've ever stopped to think about it. And there's just a lot of, you know, unlearning to be done in that sense, a lot of
Yeah.
unpacking as well. So that's the first, and the hard part about having this conversation is that, well, for men and people with penises, they're like, well, of course she's liking what we're doing. There's more lack of self-awareness of the
Mm,
situation in that context, or even just like what is it? Well, what is it that we can be doing more of? They did a study with, I don't remember the exact amount of participants, but it was in the thousands, and it was comparing the variety of queer couples and sex scripts versus straight couples. And queer couples generally engaged in like 8 to 9 different behaviors during a sexual act, and straight couples like up to 3, and it's generally the kissing, a little bit of oral and penetration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that just really highlight, like, I am in a straight relationship, and I can say like that can be very much the default if I let it be, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, I feel like we're all susceptible to that. And listen, like, for some women and people with vulvas, like, penetration is the thing, and that's great. Like, I'm not shaming that at all. You need to understand what works for you, but for a lot of us it's not. Like, there's so much more to it. So I think it's really important for you to start exploring, like, well, what is the kind of sex that I want to have? This actually reminds me of Dr. Emily Nagoski. She talks about, yeah, the
She's great.
three. She's great. The three characteristics shared by couples who have lasting sexual connection. And one of the three is that they realize that they have been following other people's models of how they should be, like, living their lives and
Yeah.
their sex
Mm-hmm.
lives, and they decide to create their own rules. And so I think this is like a
Their own
very,
like sexual script. Like, what do you want? What do you need? Right? Getting outside of the
yeah,
box. And I think, like, as you were talking, you speak volume also in my relationship. I'm married, I'm in a heterosexual relationship. And, you know, again, when you were even talking about the study, like, I feel like there are such significant heterosexual expectations on how our sex should be, right? And when you look at that study you just outlined, for individuals in the queer community, like, they have to think outside of the box. Like, they're also used to exploring things differently and having to advocate in a way that maybe a heterosexual individual doesn't have to because of the quote privilege associated with that sexual orientation. And I've noticed that even with the couples I've worked with, you know, how many times I've heard a woman say, like, I'm okay having sex with him, it gets a check. Like, I'm like, oh, no duty sex. Like, your sex needs to be about you. What do you want? And
yeah,
like you said, like most women, we never really got that opportunity to sit down and be like, I actually don't know. I don't know what I want because it really hasn't been set up for our success when we're talking about heterosexual sex and the desires. And I think that's a really important concept you brought up because I feel like it's such a big barrier for a lot of women and vulva owners, for the interaction and the pleasure piece, because you talked about bland, but I can't tell you how many people I've met that sex just also sucks all around. It's not enjoyable. It's not
yeah,
pleasurable.
yeah. No, it's not, and it's way more common than we imagine it to be, you
Yeah,
know?
100%.
Yeah.
Now, can I ask you, I don't know if you know a lot about it, but you did bring up before also the effects hormones play in terms of the differences in our desire. Are you able to talk a little bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, number one, I think just starting off on like a baseline, testosterone really for me is the big divider between like how most men and women tend to experience desire. Even with my friends who have taken testosterone supplements at some point in their life, they've mentioned like the boost in desire that it causes is so immediate, right? That should not be the reason why you should take it, but I think it speaks volumes. And I was talking to a fellow educator in the space, and she was mentioning like we just don't talk about that enough, like that being a big driver behind spontaneous and responsive desire. But more importantly, like as women especially go through perimenopause, which can start in your late 30s
Mm.
and then later through menopause, like declining estrogen levels have, you know, an impact on your desire as well. And so you end up having less quality of sleep, and you are unable to think as clearly, and you have less energy, and all of these things were like, if you're looking at, your main indicators, like hormonal indicators, if you're not already working on doing like a hormonal replacement therapy, you're going to suffer because your quality of life is declining, right?
Yeah.
Progesterone levels too. But like, it's something that unfortunately we go through, and there's been such little research that goes into helping us improve this. And I mean, if men went through this, like, there would be so much research around it. And so that's why I'm such a big advocate for hormonal replacement therapy, like
Yeah.
as quickly as you can. The earlier on that you start, the better it is, actually. So
Yeah, 100%. And you're speaking, and I'm going to self-disclose just because we're having a conversation here about this. I'm currently experiencing perimenopause, and first and foremost, like the fighting I've had to do to get the type of attention and support has been quite honestly absolutely insane. But like how that does affect then how I'm showing up with my husband, like, I was dealing with discomfort. I didn't know that I needed to be on estradiol cream, and that
yeah.
then affected my desire. Even if I'm the type of person that's responsive, which I am, I'm more of the responsive person. Like, now you add that extra layer that the hormones are causing. Like, even if you're responsive, like, you're going to struggle to want to respond if you're uncomfortable in your body because of the differences in how the hormones are affecting you. And you're right, there's absolutely scarce research, like very little. When I was going to pick my topic for my dissertation, was one of the things I was navigating towards, because I couldn't believe how little research there is for us in terms of our experiences and how that affects us. And I think then, like what you talked about earlier about also expectations, then play a heavier weight on like how we should be showing up. I've said it before to other people. I truly believe a lot of divorces, and this is not a stat, so I'm speaking purely from my own thoughts and assumptions here, but like, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of divorces are because of a woman's body's changes that are occurring, and then the lack of wanting to show up in the bedroom because of everything changing, not really understanding it other than like, I'm struggling with my desire here. Does that make sense?
It does, but I've just found, because a lot of men come to me first, and they actually
Interesting.
they want the help for their wives, and there's a lot of, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but in general, I see that the men are seeking more of the help. So they do want to stay with their wives, but sometimes the wives just either may not be interested at all in, um, exploring that sexual part of themselves, which is totally valid. You're like, I'm over it. Don't want to do this. It can feel like a lot. There can be a lot of trauma and shame to unpack. Um, but I think something that I really love is when you come across the studies that demonstrate that if you do want to build a fulfilling sex life, that your orgasms and your level of satisfaction can be much stronger post-menopause.
Mm.
So there is hope, you know.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's actually awesome that you have a lot of men reaching out, the husbands in relationships reaching out, because, I feel like we also are kind of seeing times are changing where people are understanding and recognizing like we can't just sit back. Like, we have to become educated and informed. And, I teach human sexuality at a college, and I can't tell you how many times students tell me, like, back when they were in elementary school, how they were separated when they had the
Yeah.
talk, right? And so, like, you can't build empathy or understand each other. And, for like you said, some people are not ready to explore or lean in, and it can be very scary. And, I would also assume a lot of pressure, if your partner is wanting you to be more involved and you're struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I think that you need a higher professional help. Like,
Mm.
it's going to be so much cheaper for you to invest in this help than it is for you to continue living in an unhealthy or unhappy relationship, or divorce.
Yeah.
Like, I've had potential clients ask me that, and I'm just like, the best thing for you to know is that you've tried like you've exhausted all the possibilities. And based on what you're telling me, coming to me right now, it seems like I am one of the last resorts. And so, and I think, sex therapy, sex coaching does tend to fall into that like Hail Mary kind
Yeah,
of
I mean,
bucket.
I'm also like probably the fourth or fifth stop for most of the clients that come to me because
Yeah.
it's the Googling, it's the self-help books, watching and trying. And I think there's also a level of like, I should be able to fix this, right? And not knowing or feeling comfortable going outward, asking a professional, because I think there's also still stigma even in that as well, and I think you bring a good point, just seeking that qualified professional, like, yeah, it's an investment, but it's a short-term investment compared to, like you said, like divorce. I joke about that with my clients all the time that come to me. I'm probably going to be cheaper than the divorce if that's what you're
Yeah.
like leaning into. Um,
Yeah.
but can I take a shift more towards the excitement side of desire quickly? Because now my
Yeah.
ADHD brain is wandering. I'm curious, and I'm definitely probably taking advantage of you being here in asking this. But for those of us who are maybe more responsive, and a lot of us who have ADHD, we struggle staying attentive, staying like
Hmm.
focused. And generally, that can be really due to lack of sensation and
Yeah.
stimulation. And I think it goes back to what you were talking about, the blandness. From the work you've done, do you have any tips, tricks, things to maybe possibly add or be mindful of when we're exploring to maybe create more excitement, more novelty in our desire, in the interactions we're having?
I think there needs to be more touch involved. Like you mentioned, it needs to very much be focused on sensation and bringing your mind back to sensation. Just in general, one of the tips that I give clients who are like, I am very much in my head and I have a hard time, you know, being present in the moment, regardless of ADHD or not,
Yeah.
is when you are in the middle of sex and that happens, it's very much like use your voice, like, grunt, moan, like express yourself, because when you're doing so, you're bringing yourself back in the moment. Um, with hands, like focus, like hold each other, focus on the sensation, like whatever is going on, like how is that feeling for you? And try to focus on that as well, because that's just going to help you ground yourself in the moment, and the breathing too. So, like, depending on what sexual act you're doing, like making sure that you're breathing and maybe even synchronizing your breath with your partner can be a really great way for you to be more present. But in terms of exercises, like that's just some advice. Like if you're in the middle of sex and you feel like your mind is wandering, I think like sensate focus, erogenous zones, exercises, things where you're like, we're going to sit down now and we're going to touch each other, not necessarily sexually, but it is erotic. And we're going to understand like what feels good and just follow the
Mm,
pleasure. And I think focusing on that and exploring it in a way that doesn't have the pressure of necessarily having sex and leading to penetration, or whatever sex like acts or part of your regular sex script, it just allows you to explore more freely and keep tapping into the sensation that will keep you present. Does that make
yeah.
sense?
No, that makes total sense. And I really like that, the idea of exploring your body and just finding different areas instead of trying to do the same routine over and over again, or not giving yourself that space. Like I think to myself, brushing your teeth. I know that sounds weird, but like how many of us actually are being mindful in the moment of all the sensations that are occurring when we're brushing our teeth? I would argue that I think a lot of us get trapped in that same procedural like routine, even when we're being intimate and being sexual with our partners. And I think that's a wonderful idea you just gave. Really tap into what feels right for you, giving yourself also that space. I would assume also that strengthens communication, the after talk of like, was that good for you? Did you like that? Why did you like that? And it creates more of that like engagement. And I'm assuming this is also most likely probably in your desire deck as well. It's engaging, how do you have the conversations that also connect you to want to be responsive to your partner and engage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the benefits of the cards is that just for any card game, really, it's the card that's asking the question, not you. So you don't feel that pressure of like you asking the wrong question or like how to guide the conversation. Because if that, generally, you'll see that one card will naturally lead into a much longer conversation. But if that ends, like you just have another card to pull from, right? And so it'll keep on going. And I think that can be like a very it can have a very like soothing effect on the entire concept of having a conversation about sex with your partner.
And that's actually where your deck actually is very ADHD friendly because I've dabbled in other decks and you've guided it in such a nice way where the pressure is not on me. It's not on my husband. We don't have to think about anything. Everything is orchestrated for us. And that also speaks that novelty piece, that excitement. Like we've been looking forward to our engagement because of things like your desire cards, getting into understanding each other more. I did one of the activities. I'm giving like a little giveaway here, but we had to find an object in the room and like close our eyes and put it all over our body. And we had to guess, and we both got it right. And like me and him were so excited. It was like, this is fun. This is interesting. And we were like little kids again, playing, enjoying the connection we were having, which was just so great. Now, I am curious, with my listeners in mind, a lot of us are also on medication. And some of the medication that can be taken, whether it be for anxiety, depression, ADHD, all can possibly have effects on our desire. And I'm curious if you have any kind of navigations on how to navigate those types of changes in desire due to possible medication.
Yeah, that's really hard. I think it's one of the biggest conundrums of like modern day medicine
Yeah.
and the impact that it's having on how people are having sex today. And I think it always goes back to exploring sensation and finding new ways to navigate. We just have to adapt at different stages. And so it's like what you just mentioned, one of the exercises where you're gathering different objects. You can go to your local sex shop and ask for help. Like, what are different toys and accessories that can play around with sensation play that we're going to come back home and in like a very low stakes environment, you're going to maybe like blindfold each other and you're going to use a feather on your body or a pinwheel or ice or a massage candle and just start seeing like what parts of your body get activated, what feels like what kind of sensation feels good, what can turn you on. Consider maybe audio erotica or literary erotica, things that can really start to like stimulate your imagination more so that you can find different ways that can arouse you that maybe you had never considered prior to taking the medication. Like it really is an act of exploration. And if you want to embody more of that erotic mindset, like what does that entail, right? Because sometimes like you do think, okay, I'm accepting the fact that like during the time that I'm taking this medication, I'm probably not going to be as sexual as I was before. And that's okay. Like it will take
Mm,
a backseat and it can be periodic. And if this is something that's for life and it's something that you actually because you can be like, I'm fine with the way that it is, and that's
mm-hmm,
totally okay too. But if you do want to cultivate more of that sensuality and being able to connect more with your arousal, then I think you just need to do a lot of exploration in terms of the sensations. It always goes back to sensation. Like, what are the sensations that work for you? What's the mindset that you need to be in? I mean, I know we haven't talked about this yet, but this is like a very common part of our work, which is like understanding what are the contexts that work for you and how that can like
mm-hmm.
change over time. But
Yeah.
what do you need in place for you to be able to become like aroused and feel desire.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important for you to consider. Like it's a larger work to be done.
Hmm.
But it is just trying to, and sometimes you might need a more powerful, intimate device, right? To
Mm.
like get you going as well. Like to, because that one thing that's very common is that there is like a lack of sensitivity to, um, to any like stimulation. And so
And
it's
I think
important for you to,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think what you're also talking about, and what I keep hearing from the things that you're saying is that like everything is lived on a spectrum. It is, like
yeah,
you said, a variable, but I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask that question because I know how easy it is for so many people to get trapped in the black and white thinking of possibilities, especially when it comes to our sex and our playtime. And I love that you're speaking volume to it doesn't have to be one way, that you can
yeah,
explore on so many different levels. And sometimes your exploration doesn't always have to lead to the big shebang, even orgasm. It could just be a session of exploration and you leave it there. Like you're speaking weight to it being what you want, when you want it, how you need it. But again, going back to that conversation and the communication, that's vital because if you're playing a mind reader or you're using expectations that aren't set up for either of you and your desire, you're failing or you're setting yourself up for failure versus all of the amazing possibilities you can have, like you just basically outlined.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I just want people to start thinking about sex and pleasure as something that really is explorative and that's playful. Like sex is adult play, and I think we take it too seriously.
100%. When I hear the word sex, and this probably comes from my own experience as well, it doesn't sound very inviting for me. And I have to say that's also an experience a lot of my clients feel. And so I like to tell people, like, in order for us to learn play, we have to unlearn sex. Because when I hear the
Yeah,
word play, I think of like when we were kids, you wanted to go out, engage, have a good time. Like that's where and how we should be wanting to engage with our partners. And for so long, even in my marriage, I'll remember it, like a year into our relationship, after I started becoming more educated, getting my certification and my education, I looked at my partner at the time, who's my husband now, and I was like, I'm done faking my orgasms. I can't do this anymore. Like, I want to have a good time. And like, I've continued to grow in that. Like you said, like things fluctuate. Like there are some good times in our playtime, and then other times where it's like, okay, we need to regroup again. Let's have a conversation. What's working? What's not working? Sometimes it goes back to blandness. Even when you have it all figured out, it's going to fluctuate, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I love the work you're doing. I think it's a wonderful passion of yours. I definitely think everyone should go follow you, get your desire
Thank
deck,
you.
because indeed, like empowering yourselves to want to engage and have a good time, that's freaking glorious. That's beautiful. Like I'm all perked up because it's exciting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, before we wrap up, do you have any last words of encouragement, empowerment, advice that you feel my listeners, can really take from today?
Sex is one of the most is I think it is the most complex thing that you'll ever engage in, right? I say this often, but it's called an eco-biopsychosocial phenomenon for a reason. So just, be very kind with yourself. Like it's normal for you to feel like it's overwhelming, like you're carrying a lot into bed, that it can be really hard to navigate sometimes, and when it's easy, like celebrate the ease of it, but don't be too hard on yourself for whatever it is that you might be going through, because it truly is like a complex act that we do. So I just want to normalize that for everybody.
I think that's awesome. I'm definitely on board with the normalization of that. Thank you so much for being with me today. And I hope all my listeners got amazing, amazing information on desire. And until next time. If you want to dive deeper into desire, follow Natasha on Instagram and check out her desire deck and sexual desire masterclass. All the links you need are right in the description. If this episode helped and resonated with you, please hit that share, follow, and subscribe button.